If you've ever wondered what it's like to follow a wild stallion for his whole life, then this episode is for you. I'm your host, Carol Walker, and let's get started. Welcome to the Freedom for Wild Horses podcast, the place to find out about wild horses in the American West and what you can do to help them stay wild and free. If you love wildlife, wild horses, and the freedom that they stand for, this show is for you. I'm your host, Carol Walker. Let's get started. I began visiting the McCullough Peaks herd near Cody in 2004, and I've continued visiting this herd, my favorite herd, 2 to 3 times a year since then. I met Thor for the first time in the summer of 2011. There had been a helicopter roundup in October 2009 where hundreds of horses were removed from the range. And because the BLM had not gotten around to giving birth control to the remaining mares, there was a baby boom in the summer of 2011. Nature compensates for losses in the population, which actually makes it counterintuitive to do roundups and removals. Some of the most colorful wild horses in McCullough Peaks were born that spring and summer, including Thor. Thor's mother, Taboo, a stunning blue-eyed Pinto mare, had been Stallion Booker Rose's mare with her foal Jigsaw for a year and a half, and then Booker Rose lost her to another stallion before Thor was born. However, he continued to stay close to Taboo and Thor. I found Thor napping in the flowers on a summer's day with several families of wild horses who were normally very hard to get close to. They were some of the wildest on the range, so I walked very slowly and carefully toward them, and immediately I thought that Thor was the most beautiful foal I had ever seen, with his blue eyes and distinctive faded Sabino Pinto markings. I watched Booker Rose be protective with baby Thor, ushering him back to his family when he wandered a little too far. I knew from the first time I met him that Thor was a very special wild horse. I always looked for him when I visited McCullough Peaks. That winter, as he grew, I found him with a thick woolly coat and mischief in his blue eyes. In the winter of 2013, because there were so many foals born in 2011, the Bureau of Land Management decided they needed to remove 20 horses, but this time they used bait trapping, which was completed in only 2 weeks. I talked to the wild horse and burro expert after the bait trapping, and she told me she almost removed Thor, but did not. And I told her I was incredibly grateful that she had not. His mother, Taboo, is a non-responder to PZP, meaning despite getting darted with birth control every year, she continues to have foals. So her genetic contribution to the herd was and continues to be considerable. In 2013, Taboo was with 2 stallions of the same age, a bay stallion named Hudson Bay and a bay Pinto stallion named Taliqua. The 2 confused me a little because I could not tell who was in charge and who was the lieutenant. They both seemed to have equal authority and equal breeding rights, and Thor was kicked out of the family that winter as a 2.5-year-old. As a 3-year-old, I loved watching him act as a rowdy teenager, running and playing and practice fighting with the other young stallions in preparation for one day having families of their own. Sometimes I would find Thor on his own, sometimes wandering with other young bachelors, and sometimes I find him near his former family. Because of his small size, I wondered if he would ever have his own family, since so many of the stallions at McCullough Peaks are much bigger and heavier. In 2017, I found Thor Dogging Utah's family. Utah was one of the wildest of the wild stallions, often snorting when he saw me and running away, but his stunning bald face and tall stockings made him an impressive sight. He had his longtime mare, Shakira, a flashy, mainly black Pinto mare, and their daughter, Suki, a black filly with a distinctive squiggly mark on her face. Thor followed them constantly, getting as close to Shakira as he possibly could, until Utah kept chasing him away. But Thor was incredibly persistent. Utah was old and getting frailer, and Shakira was very beautiful. Thor could wait him out. The next time I went to the range, Thor had finally won Shakira. Utah had disappeared, likely to pass away quietly in the remote areas of the range, and Suki was with another family. But Shakira did not look happy to be around Thor. In fact, she finally joined Taliqua's band. Hudson Bay had disappeared, and Thor was barely tolerated at the outskirts of the family. He kept trying to stay close to Shakira, but she had absolutely no interest in him. Gradually, Thor became accepted by Taliqua's family and became an active lieutenant. A lieutenant's job is to fight off other stallions, keep the family together, and watch out for trouble heading the family's way. Thor was small, but he was mighty in spirit and would diligently drive off rival stallions. Thor's mother, Taboo, was in this family, and ironically, in 2020, Booker Rose, his father, started following the family. Not allowed in as close as Thor was, but almost a secondary lieutenant. Booker Rose and Thor had a respectful relationship, having a few minor dust-ups but never a serious fight. It was amazing seeing the two of them together. Booker Rose disappeared in 2021. Thor was always a very active lieutenant, and Taliqua seemed completely content to let Thor do the heavy lifting. In 2022, it became clear that no one ever left this family. The fillies grew into mares and stayed, whereas usually they would go off with stallions and form their own families, or a stallion would steal them. The colts grew up and stayed, and eventually there was another colorful lieutenant, Tupi, who took the mare Totsi, but stayed with the family. And two stallions dogging the band and frequently sparring with Thor was a stunning black Pinto Sorcerer and black stallion Dale. In 2022, the black and white mare Dakota gave birth to a little filly who was clearly Thor's because of her almost identical markings. But she did not survive more than a few days. And then, in late August of 2023, Thora was born. And she not only survived but thrived. She looked just like her dad and had a spunky personality to match. She was the darling of the whole family, jealously guarded by her aunties, especially Shakira. But tragedy was in store for the McCullough Peaks herd. In January 2023, the BLM announced plans to remove 40 wild horses from the herd using bait trapping, and the plan was to remove mainly horses 5 years old or under, leaving the older horses alone. We were very concerned because it's a small, aging herd, and many of the older horses died over the summer and fall. In a herd with this small a size, maintaining genetic health is a precarious matter. Despite all the comments and the calls and the concerns of the public, the bait trapping started in November. But the BLM was having a hard time capturing horses. One of the first horses removed from the eastern part of the range was Thora. There was a huge public outcry because she was such a favorite. But the BLM would not relent and, in fact, removed 4 more young horses from Taliqua's family. Then, at the beginning of March, as time was running out for the bait trapping, the BLM came in and removed 25 horses, including many horses over 13, who never should have been removed. Entire families were wiped out. Stallions were left without their mares, mares without their stallions, and whole important genetic lines were removed, putting the health of the herd in jeopardy. 2 weeks ago, I went to the McCullough Peaks. It was incredibly sad to look for horses I'd known and not be able to find them. It was also unnaturally quiet for spring, usually one of the most active times of the year, with babies being born and stallions vying for mares. In Taliqua's family, there were no new foals yet, but Dale had taken Totsi, Tupi's mare, since Tupi had died, and they were following closely, and Totsi had a new Pinto foal, Tupelo. When I was driving toward the east side of the range, I saw Taliqua's family right near and inside the fence, not far from the road. I found a safe place to pull over and got out and walked toward the fence. I stood and watched the family napping and grazing, and then noticed Thea was getting up and then laying down, and I wondered if she were colicking. Then water gushed out of her, and I began to see a leg. She was giving birth. I stood very still, and the horses seemed unaware of my presence. I called my friend Sandy, who was on another part of the range, and said, "You need to come. A mare is foaling." I watched with fascination and concern, hoping the little one would come as soon as possible with no complications. The whole process only took about 30 minutes, with Thea's mom, Taboo, and the other mares standing around her. And then there was a little Pinto filly who looked just like Taliqua. Thor had been standing back behind Thea and the mares during the birth, but eventually he ran in to take a look. Thea was very protective of the little filly who was trying to stand, and Thor backed off and watched. Eventually, the filly that I named Tessa got up on wobbly legs and figured out how to nurse from her mother. Soon after that, the whole family moved off, and I decided to look for them the next day. But when I got up in the morning, it was snowing and cold. I drove out and eventually found them across the creek with no way to get anywhere near, so I got out my very long lens and took photos from the road. Tessa was sleeping when I got there, but when she got up, she seemed able to keep up with her mother with no problem. 1 day old and in the snow. These wild horses are really tough. That afternoon, the snow had melted and the family had moved to an area that was more accessible. They were moving and grazing, and nearby was Splash and his family, and Dale and Totsie and Toopy. Tessa looked very tired and lay down for a nap. The rest of the family continued moving and grazing, and soon Splash was getting a little too close to Thea and Tessa. Thea started turning around, agitated and stressed, and I wondered when Thor or Taliqua would notice. Finally, Thor ran over and chased Splash off, and got Tessa and Thea moving to join the rest of the family. The next morning, I met my friend Sandy, and we drove out to watch the family and to see how Tessa was doing. She seemed much stronger and had no trouble keeping up with her family. It's amazing how fast foals grow. Splash was in the area, but not too near. Dale ran up and started sparring with Thor. The two of them reared up against the blue sky. I had seen them spar like this many, many times, so I was not concerned. They stopped after a couple of minutes, and Dale backed off with Totsie and Tupelo. As the family continued to move and graze, I drove to go see Tuff and Tully before heading to Rock Springs to visit the 39 captured McCullough Peaks horses that were at the corrals. I had just learned that only the mares would be offered in the online corral adoption in May, on the 6th of May to the 13th of May, because they had not gotten around to gelding the stallions yet. Also, 2 of the mares had foaled at the facility, and 2 were heavily pregnant, so those 4 mares would not be offered for adoption for 6 to 8 months until the foals were weaned. The stallions, soon to be geldings, would be offered in the July 8th through 15th online corral event. The BLM would not allow me inside the facility to see the horses, so I hiked around the outside and was able to see and photograph everyone through 2 fences. They all looked well, and Thora and the 2 younger foals with her had a lot of hay in their pen. The next day, after I'd been out with Saltwell's Creek horses, I heard that Thor had died. My first thought was, no, that can't have happened. Then I was in shock. I had just seen him. I had been sure when I left 2 days ago that I would see him again in July. But he was gone. A blow to the head and a fight with Dale was what I heard was the cause. It seemed impossible. But it was true, he was gone. I was devastated. When I recorded the video for the fundraiser for the McCullough Peaks horses to help them get adopted and have a safe landing while I was at the corrals, I had to stop and record it 4 different times because when I mentioned that I was dedicating the fundraiser to Thor, I kept crying. He has been such a big part of my life and time with the wild horses. His memory and spirit are so strong. They will always be with me, and with so many other people who were privileged to spend time with him in the wild, and with all the people who followed his adventures on social media. Thor lived his entire life wild and free, never captured, never away from his home, and all of our wild horses deserve to live out their lives on our public lands the same way. Thank you for listening to this episode of Freedom for Wild Horses. If you'd like to donate to help support the McCullough Peaks wild horses that are up for adoption, please go to fortheloveofarea.org and mark your donation for the McCullough Peaks horses. Thank you for listening to this episode of Freedom for Wild Horses. If you want to learn more, follow me at www.wildhoofbeats.com for more information and for ways to help America's wild horses. See you next time.